Hi everybody. Today I wanted to start with a simple bar graph in Excel, one that would be appropriate to put into an APA style manuscript. So I've done a couple of data collection and then some statistics in order to put this through Excel. We need a couple of bits of information. Again, this is a simple bar graph for a t-test, so they're really only going to be 2 bars. So here is my JASP output. I've been using JASP now for the last few months, and for the most part, it is a pretty decent engine and free alternative to SPSS. So here is my independent samples t-test that I ran. I did it on this data set here, which is just a created data set, doesn't really mean much of anything. And I use the grouping variable here on whether or not people would prefer to pursue a PhD versus not pursue a PhD. And these are all psychology students. So here's the output of the t-test, and you can see that there's a difference between the 2 groups. And so it would be useful to put this information into graph form. Now, some people might say that putting this information to a graph form is not really all that useful, but you know, an exercise is an exercise. So let's go ahead and put this t-test into an APA style a figure. So here I have my 2 groups, people who don't want to pursue a PhD and people who do want to pursue a PhD. And my dependent variable is how many hours of work per week that they put in to studying and that sort of thing. And so we have our 2 sample sizes, 18 and 20, so fairly equal groups. Here we have our means. This is the first set of information that's important to make our graph. And then we have our standard deviation. We're going to ignore the standard deviation for the graph, and then here we have our standard errors for the 2 groups, which is going to be our second piece of important information to make error bars on this graph. So let's go ahead and set up the file. Now, honestly, you can put the information anywhere you want. I'm using Alt-Tab to switch between windows. So let's put a simple label here, no PhD, and then yes PhD. And then we're going to put the means in the cells beneath the appropriate box. So no was 10.39. Honestly, you can round or not round, it's not a big deal. And then the other number was 3.65. Now don't pay attention too heavily to these 2 numbers and what that means. Oh, I'm sorry. It's not work toward the degree. It's work outside of work outside of studying. So like a job. Sorry, that was what I should have said. Now, what I like to do is just put a standard error marker right here to indicate that's where my standard errors are going to go. So Alt-Tab over again, and so we put the standard errors in the same orientation as my means. So this mean would have this standard error right here, and this mean would have this standard error here. And when you put this into a figure, into a plot in Excel, Excel reads this in order when you put it through the standard, when you put it through the error bar function. So here we have 2.44 for over here. Again, rounding, not rounding, it's up to you. 1.17, okay? So we don't need JASP anymore. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to highlight the means and my labels, and I'm going to go over to Insert, and here you have all of the charts. Now, I tend to ignore recommended charts because I already know what I plan on making beforehand. So here is where I'm going to do a column or bar chart. Now, Excel calls vertical bars columns and horizontal bars charts. So, you know, they make that distinction. As graph makers, we are not going to make that distinction. So we're actually going to stick around over here with 2D column at the top. Now you want to choose the clustering of this because these are easier to read than these stacked graphs. And these stacked graphs don't really mean much of anything with only 2 pieces of data. So I click on that, and it brings up the default maker here. So I'm going to make that a little bit bigger for you so you can see. So there, the Excel default figure is not APA. Let's just put it out there. It is not APA. You don't necessarily need error bars, but you kind of want error bars to give the reader of your figure a little bit more information. For a simple graph like just a t-test with 2 bars, independent t-test with 2 bars, you know, there's not a lot of playing around that you need to do with it. But Excel, especially Excel 2016 and beyond, really plays around with visual aesthetics that aren't necessarily APA, at least to my understanding of APA figures. Now, there's, again, a lot of nuance and personal preference, but there are some things that just aren't, that just shouldn't be in the graph. And things that aren't here that should be here, as you'll see in just a second. So the first thing I want to do is get rid of this chart title. We don't need a chart title. And that is because figures, when they go into manuscripts, generally have figure captions, and that's where you describe the figure itself in the caption. Okay. The next thing I want to do is go over to Add Chart Element over here, where it has all of the pieces that you need for this chart itself, for the figure. And I'm going to do axis titles, and this brings up the axis label for the x-axis or the horizontal, which is this one, and then the vertical axis or the y-axis, which is, as you can see, it pops up every time I move back and forth. So let's do the primary horizontal axis, and it brings up the box with just the words axis title. You just double click on it to get rid of the words axis title, and then you write in whatever it is you want. I'm going to do career aspiration for the x-axis label, and then I go back to chart element, axis titles, primary vertical, and again I double click. It's a little more difficult to get, there we go, to get on the double click because it is sideways. And then I'm going to put here hours, well, I can do hours spent working outside of job. So we have that. I don't know why I wrote outside of job here, so I'm just gonna, outside of school is really what I wanted to say. Outside of school. Yeah, probably a better axis title for that, but you know, that works for our purposes here. So here we have our basic graph now. I have my axes labeled. Now I need to mess with the visual aesthetics of the graph. So you can see here we have some faint grid lines going horizontally across the grid. Now again, nuance associated with how things should look, but APA generally wants a clear background, so it makes the charts pop from the background. And so we go to add chart elements to grid lines, and you can see here that I've got four options. Now, the green option is already highlighted. That's the primary, major, horizontal. Now, when I'm hovering over it, you can see on the graph that they disappear. So when I select this with the pointer, they go away. All the other ones were turned off. Okay. Now, I have a situation with the axes that is slightly annoying, which is the x-axis is this faint gray color. Can't really tell it's there. And then the y-axis isn't actually there at all. So we're going to have to mess with those. So we go back to chart elements. Oh, wait, no. Cancel that. We can double click on the axis and it'll bring up format axis options. So down here you see tick marks. Tick marks is where the major and minor tick marks for the axis will show up. But we don't need those for the x-axis because these are categorical variables, and so there aren't really any spaces in between these two bars that we need to show sort of on a number line. So instead of going to the axis options here, we're going to go over to the fill and line, and we want to check the line options. And here you can see the color is automatic, and we see this light gray color already selected. So we are going to change that. Now, easiest way to do this is to just change it to black, and it'll make a solid black line, and that to me is appropriate against a white background. So we can go ahead and close that as well, and if we click away from the graph, you can see that the line itself is nice and black. Same thing over here. We can double click on the y-axis. Again, it brings up the axis options. This is where we need tick marks. We are going to choose here for major type. Now, major type tick marks correspond to the numbers that are presented here on the graph. Minor type would be tick marks in between these spaces. So here we have from 0 to 12, and the spacing is by 2s. Okay. And so any minor type would be anything in between 2, like 3, any odd number basically. So we want minor, we want major type tick marks. And so again, you have 3 options for this, as opposed to not having them at all, which is none. Inside the line, outside the line, or crossing the line. So again, visual aesthetics on where you want this. I would likely choose outside or crossing the axis line. Generally speaking, I choose outside. Okay, as you can see, it pops the axis line there, and it made a black line for us. So if I click away here, click there, it copied the style from the x-axis and put my black y-axis line there with a tick mark for each of the numbers shown. Alright, so next, we would like to make some of these words and letters a little bit bigger so we can read them, so they're readable. Now, as far as font goes, Calibri is a fine font. APA suggests a sans serif font, so that is without any of the little serifs at the end of letters that you see on like Times New Roman, for example. And so Calibri is a fine, readable for most individuals font to use. However, we do need to make them a little bit bigger. So the way that I do this is rather simple. So I just click on the axis, and so it brings up the chart tools. We don't want the chart tools. We go back to home, where we have font and font size, and I go up here to the font size, and I just put in 14. So that makes the axis labels huge. Not huge, but big. And I can do that again. All I have to do is click on the axis label and just type 14, and there it goes. Okay. Same thing here. Go back up to the font size, hit 14. Again, you'd probably want something a little more succinct than hours spent working outside of school, because, you know, that's wordy. And the last thing I want to do is, again, double-clicking on the y-axis brings up the axis options, but I don't actually need those because I can go over here and click on 14, and it will increase the size of the text. All right, so I can close the axis options, click away, and we are almost done with this bar graph. The last thing I want to do is deal with these standard errors, put error bars on the bars themselves. So we click on the graph, and we go to Design, Add Chart Element, Error Bars. Now, it says standard errors here, but I'm not entirely sure where Excel is getting this information. So we're going to ignore that for now, since we have put all of the data from JASP in here through Scratch. So we're going to more error bar options, and so it brings up the Format Error Bars dialog box here at the end. Okay, and so you have a couple of visual pieces of information. Now the direction of the error, which is positive to the mean and then negative to the mean, that's both. This is generally what you see in empirical papers presenting you with error bars. They'll be both the positive and negative direction. You could have the minus only. Sometimes you will see this if bars go below the 0 point of the x-axis, and then you have the plus, which you'll see, many times you see in older empirical papers, because they had to use black, and the only way that this would show is just by doing the plus, because the bar itself would be black, and so a black error bar on top of a black bar just wouldn't work. Now we have the ability to do things in color, grayscale shading, that sort of thing. The other visual option is whether or not it has an end cap or not. So by default, APA selection would be to both directions and cap, and this is my personal preference as well. Again, there's some nuance here. There's personal preference on where it comes from. Now, the last piece of the options here is where the information for the error amount comes from. You can do fixed values, and so this would be useful if your standard errors for your means were the same exact number. That is obviously not the case here. We have two different numbers. Percentages, that's never helpful. Standard deviations, again, that's not helpful. Standard errors, not entirely sure where Excel would be getting this information, since we didn't run any standard error calculations. And then finally, where we want to go is custom. Okay, custom now defaults the error bars to 1. But so we're going to click on specify value, and it brings up this little custom error bar box. So we have the positive error value and the negative error value. Now, what Excel wants you to do here is to select the values in the spreadsheet for them, and you're going to do the same thing for positive as for negative. So whatever you put in the positive box here, you will put in the negative box here. And the easiest way to do it, again, no PhD, yes PhD, no PhD, yes PhD. So when I drag this across here, it's going to read this as the error bar for no PhD and the error bar for yes PhD. Now, I need to do this for the negative value as well. You'll want to highlight the equals curly brackets 1 because we need to replace that information, those characters, with the spreadsheet values. Okay, so you always got to have an equal sign. If something didn't copy over or highlight over or replace anything, you'll get an error you'll get a Excel error that indicates you have made a mistake. Okay. So here we are, we're going to hit OK, and there you go. It has put in those two error bars. And you can see here that for the mean of 10.39, we had a standard error of 2.44. This bar itself is very large. And then for the 3.65 yes Ph.D., which is this mean right here, the error bar itself was 1.17, which is about half the size in both directions of this error bar, and you can double check your work like that. Now we close up everything, and then there is our completed APA single t-test bar graph. Thanks for watching.